Solutions Development Branch under the Office of Enterprise Technology Solutions within the Information Technology category here at GSA's Federal Acquisition Service. In addition to myself, we also have from my team, Kevin Guffrey, who is one of the section leads under the Solutions Development Branch. I just want to start off with a little bit of history here. OMB released Memo 1926 back in September of 2019, titled Update to the Trusted Internet Connection Initiative. And the purpose of that memo was to enhance network security across the federal government, especially with all the increased cloud-based networking environments. We're fortunate today to have subject matter experts from the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, here today to present the most recent updates on TIC 3.0 activities. We have Mr. Kevin Wortman, who will discuss the TIC 3.0 program summary, protective DNS, and efforts underway regarding Einstein E1, E2 modernization. We have Mr. Joseph Drummond, who will discuss the National Cybersecurity Protection System, NCPS, efforts, and Mr. John Sims, who will discuss the updated Zero Trust Maturity Model version 2. Once CISA has finished presenting, I will take it back and briefly present how GSA's Enterprise Infrastructure Solutions EIS contract can help you with your TIC 3.0 solutions. GSA will also facilitate a Q&A session at the end so that you have the opportunity to ask any questions that you may have. You can also type in your questions in the chat, and if we're not able to get to your question today, we'll record the questions we receive in the chat and get back to you with a response. Presentation, again, as mentioned earlier in the chat, presentation material presented today will be available by request via email, and we'll provide you that contact information later here in the session. We'll also send out an email after this meeting to you with that contact information. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to my CISA colleague, Mr. Kevin Wortman, to start us off with the TIC 3.0 program summary. Take it away, Kevin.
Great, thank you, Brian. Hello, everyone. I want to thank you, everyone, for joining today and for the opportunity to talk to you about TIC 3.0. My name is Kevin Wortman, and I'm a senior security engineer in the cybersecurity division of CISA, supporting the Trusted Internet Connection Program. Just a little bit of background on me. My subject expertise is in engineering, cloud, shared services, mobile technologies, and architectures. I have 20 plus years of operational experience in both IT support and IT security. Next slide, please. This is just a quick agenda of what I'll be talking about today. So majority of my presentation will be focused on TIC 3.0 program, talking to you about the latest updated releases, a little bit about Zero Trust, and a little bit of a deep dive into vendor overlays and how you can use those, as well as some conclusions. I'll then be giving you a brief overview about CISA's protective DNS service, and then we'll talk a little bit about CISA efforts underway to modernize E1 and E2. I'll then turn it over to my colleague, Joseph Drummond from the National Cybersecurity and Protection System to talk about the efforts that they have underway. And then John Sims, as we already mentioned, will be talking about the Zero Trust Maturity Model version 2. Next slide, please. So we'll briefly go through a program summary here. As Brian mentioned, in September of 2019, OMB released Memo M-19.26. The reason for this is because the IT modernization report called for a modernization of TIC to improve protections, remove barriers, and enable cloud migration. One of the objectives of TIC 3 was to be boundary focused in order to give guidance on what security capabilities should be in place when agency traffic from branch offices, remote users, cloud, and other service providers, including mobile devices, no longer traverse the TIC access point. This transition from TIC 2 to TIC 3 was a shift in approach from securing a single network boundary to a distributed architecture. And with the release in April 2023 of the Cloud Use Case, CISA has completed the list of use cases in Appendix A of that memo. So one of the things we just want to highlight here is with the release of that Cloud Use Case, we have completed the activities that OMB assigned to CISA in September of 2019, and it'll be the last use case specific to TIC. Any further TIC applicability will be, will be ingrained in CISA projects moving forward. Next slide, please. This just, this slide here is just an effort to show that CISA has various guidance documents that all build upon one another, and some are strategic, some are technical, some are operational, but they're all combined together, and they all build upon one another. And so you can see the list, and not just CISA, but also the Federal Zero Trust Strategy, the maturity, and then we get into the CISA documents, the Zero Trust Maturity Model, the Cloud Security Technical Reference Architecture, and then the SCUBA information and the EVRF framework all build upon one another to provide that more holistic approach. Next slide, please. So again, OMB Memo 1926 outlines the TIC 3.0 initiative requirements. What we have here is the different volumes within TIC. They are meant to be iterative. So what I mean by that, and you've probably heard this before, those who have been around for a while, is that you can't just jump to a use case within the TIC program, the TIC 3.0 program, and expect to understand the concepts and ideas behind it. So the program guidebook begins to the program guidebook begins to explain the concepts and ideas behind TIC 3.0, and then the reference archons, policy enforcement points, things of that nature. The security capabilities catalog is a list of 117 capabilities that we want agencies to consider when they're building out their trust zones and their PEPs. And then we have the use cases with the traditional use case, because we understood that agencies, some agencies will remain under, will continue to have TIC 2 architectures, but then we also have the branch office use case, the remote user use case, and the cloud use case. And then our final volume is the vendor overlay, and we'll discuss more about that. But it basically, we've worked with vendors to where they take the 117 security capabilities that are in the security capabilities catalog, and they map those to their products and services. And we'll go a little bit more into detail about that when we get to that section of the briefing. All this guidance can be found at cisa.gov/TIC. And then apologies for missing this, and I'll put it in the chat when I'm done with my briefing. But we also have a frequently asked questions page, and you would access that by just putting at the end of the link that you see on the slide, you would just put a -FAQ. At the end of that, and that's a good place to start after you've reviewed the documents and become familiar with them. If you still have some questions, that's a great place to start. That's a compilation of questions that we've received over the years about TIC 3, the most commonly asked questions, and so we've compiled a list of those commonly asked questions and provided a FAQ for more resources, more fidelity around the questions. Next slide, please. This is just a recap. So last year, during about this time frame, we released requests for comments out to the public, and this recaps what we got for feedback on that. So we received 320 comments, and we had let's see here. Yeah, 320 different comments from 26 reviewer types. What was very interesting to us of these comments was that industry was very active as part of their comments. And it was helpful to us when we were doing the final touches on it to have that industry feedback. And so we just wanted to, you can see here we had 9 different vendors, 2 consulting firms and 2 trade associations. Those we have not experienced that in the past necessarily in those numbers, and so it was good that the feedback was very diverse because it made our document even stronger than it already was. Next slide, please. So 7 key themes from the comments and responses. The first one being risk and deployment considerations. So commenters highlighted concerns that our draft use case implied that cloud deployments were riskier than on-premise deployments, and that was not what we intended to do. So we modified the text to clarify that moving from on-premise to cloud requires changes in agency policies and procedures, and that we also tried to include, excuse me, opportunities for improvement of cybersecurity posture throughout the document. The next theme was TIC 3.0 and zero trust inconsistencies. We had several commenters who pointed out that with TIC and zero trust, there were inconsistencies or they wanted more zero trust guidance. So in order to address that, we TIC wasn't, so obviously when TIC 3.0 was created, and even when we started the cloud use case, zero trust, the memos had not been released yet. And we were more focused on the network piece of this. And so we did add references to the Cyber Executive Order 14028, as well as the M-2209 Federal Zero Trust Strategy, the Zero Trust Maturity Model, and others throughout the TIC use case. We also updated some of our capability guidance as appropriate. The big comment, the major change that we had to our draft use case was that we had a lot of comments regarding cloud-to-cloud connections. And so we added a whole section on how to address cloud-to-cloud. And we'll actually talk about that here in a little bit. We also added a new trust zone labeled additional agency cloud service in the conceptual architecture to support this new pattern. Some of our comments were related around TIC compliance. They wanted a greater emphasis for compliant, greater emphasis and guidance for compliance, and that one of the things, this is a misconception with TIC. So TIC, I know many people are familiar with the old TIC program where we had required capabilities and recommended capabilities. In TIC 2, I believe there were like 76 or 78 required capabilities, and then CCVs were conducted. In TIC 3, we wanted to get away from that. We wanted agencies to have flexibility and use the security capabilities to fit them into their risk management framework and their risk appetites. So there are no mandatory requirements under TIC 3 like there were under TIC 2. And we added a call out for opportunities for using cloud solutions to automate compliance, automate policy compliance verification. The next theme was the protective DNS service. When we wrote the draft cloud use case, the protective DNS service had not been released yet. The CISA protective DNS service had not released yet. However, in September of 2022, while we were working on the final draft of the cloud use case, the DNS service resolver for federal agencies was released. And so what you'll see, and you'll see this in a couple slides, is that we actually replaced our previous capability, what talked about using E3A DNS services. We have replaced that with using CISA's DNS, protective DNS service. Our next theme was web services and policy enforcement points. There needed to be some more clarification and guidance with regards to the different uses for the word web and services. So we modified the web and services section explaining the intended role in the cloud context. And finally, we added new security capabilities, and I'll get into that in a future slide. Next slide, please. So now we'll talk about the updated releases. So again, like I mentioned, we released the final draft of the TIC Cloud Use Case in April of 2023. The purpose, it originally started that we were going to release a cloud use case and then an email use case. We decided to merge those together. So there's actually two distinct components in the cloud use case. The first component covers IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS deployments. And then the second component of the cloud use case addresses email as a service. Again, just to reiterate, this is the final use case that you will see from the TIC program. Any future TIC related activities will be incorporated into future CISA programs and projects. Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about what we updated on April 17th. So obviously we released the cloud use case in its final version. We also had to update the branch office and remote user use cases. And the reason for that is because the security capabilities catalog had a total of 38 new capabilities that were added to the list of security capabilities, bringing the total number up to 117. Some of those capabilities impacted the branch office and remote user use case, and so we modified those documents to account for those and provide use case specific guidance on how to use those. And then finally, like I mentioned earlier, we retired the E3A DNS service for the CISA protective DNS service. Next slide, please. So this is just a high-level overview, architecture overview of our IaaS, SaaS, and PaaS and SaaS use case. This is the conceptual architecture. It focuses on the scenario in which an agency has one or more cloud deployments. And traditionally, agency users have had to access cloud deployments either directly from the agency campus or by establishing a secure connection to an agency campus and using the channel to access the cloud deployment. In the new use case, that's you can see that's no longer needed. It's composed, so this conceptual architecture is composed of 8 distinct trust zones, and it also shows a single remote user, a single external partner, and a single external entity trust zone. But these simplifications are not meant to imply that an agency must treat all remote users, external partners, external agencies, or CSPs in the same manner. So where I'm going with that is, depending on the external partner or remote users or any of those other trust zones, you may apply different capabilities to those depending on the risks that they pose. Next slide, please. Now we'll talk a little bit about the cloud-to-cloud use case that was added to the TIC 3 as part of the RFC. This is the new pattern. we got a lot of feedback that agencies wanted to know how to handle cloud-to-cloud use cases. And so this security pattern shows where agency cloud resources communicate with other agency cloud resources, either through user interfaces or programmatic APIs, etc. These other cloud resources could be hosted in different cloud environments and could have different deployment models, including multi-region, multi-tenant, and multi-cloud, and also different service models such as IaaS or SaaS. And the communication between the agency cloud resources may traverse a variety of networks, regions, or CSPs. So the whole idea here was to give agencies flexibility to be able to achieve the security and guidance that we had under TIC 3 in a more flexible and modernized way. Next slide, please. This is our email as a service conceptual architecture. The email as a service guidance in the cloud use case defines how network and multi-boundary security should be applied when an agency's email service is hosted by a cloud service provider. And that the provider is responsible for the email infrastructure itself. The conceptual architecture is composed of 4 trust zones, as you can see on the slide. And again, the simplifications are meant to, they're just meant to simplify things. They're not meant to imply that an agency must treat all the entities shown here in the same manner. So the same as the cloud, the infrastructure conceptual architecture. Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about telemetry sharing. You'll see in our cloud use case, we have a section on telemetry sharing with CISA. So under the TIC program itself is non-prescriptive and allows, like the slide says, allows agencies to secure their computing environments with their risk management framework at their agency and their tolerance levels. Agencies are no longer required to validate their TIC compliance under TIC 3, nor are you required to get CISA approval for your architectures. What is required, however, is the legislative requirements around NCPS and requirements set forth in the CDM Memorandum of Agreements without exceptions. And my colleague from the NCPS program will talk to you about that in a few minutes. And then also when, I'll repeat this again when we talk about our protective DNS service, but that service is required in section with section 663 of US Code 6. Next slide, please. Same for email. The message is the same. Non-prescriptive if you're looking at it from a TIC architecture perspective. However, we still do have those legislative requirements for NCPS, the MOA for CDM, and the requirement to use CISA's protective DNS service under section 663 of US Code 6. Next slide, please. Now we'll briefly talk about the capabilities catalog. So again, there are 117 security capabilities in the catalog. When we were first beginning TIC 3, the TIC PMO focused on scoping to the TIC initiative. However, and you'll see this in a little bit, when EO 14028 and OMB Memo 2209 were released, we began the process of aligning capabilities to support zero trust. And that's why you see that we added an identity and a data PEP with the release of the cloud use case. Next slide, please. So again, here are just an overview of the capabilities. Again, there's 117 capabilities. grouped by PEPs. So we have the universal capabilities, and then we have 12 PEP capabilities. So the 117 includes both the universal as well as the individual PEPs. And there are a total of 12 of them. We have bolded out the 2 new PEPs that were added with the release of the cloud use case. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm briefly going to talk to you about TIC and Zero Trust. We are in the process of aligning, we're doing a lot of efforts, and within CISA, John will talk about that when he briefs the Zero Trust maturity model. There are a lot of efforts in CISA underway to support agencies with their Zero Trust. You're all familiar with the policies that were released, the executive order, as well as the M memo from OMB, and so that's the policy around it. Next slide, please. This is our just an overview of how you can align your TIC 3.0, your implementation of TIC 3.0 with Zero Trust. And the intent of the graphic on the slide is to show that you can't necessarily implement Zero Trust overnight. It's going to be a journey. But the new TIC model does encourage agencies to more precisely define their resources via trust zones, and that is determined by agency criteria. Some of the ways that you can the criteria can be influenced is through the structures, the application workflows, and the identities. Even though we show a peak of a mountain here, Zero Trust never really ends. Agencies will need to continuously evaluate their Zero Trust needs to maintain their Zero Trust architectures. Next slide, please. This shows how TIC 3 enhances security as well as moves to Zero Trust. So under TIC 2.0, there was this, it was one large PEP. And so if there was a compromise within that perimeter, the adversary had the potential of easily spreading throughout the entire environment. The middle diagram shows how those same resources are protected by segmenting the resources into smaller and more granular trust zones. So instead of one large PEP, the resources in each PEP are now protected, which can be tailored to their requirements. We've tried to shrink the radius of the compromise to where if one resource is impacted, the adversary does not have the same freedom to move between trust zones when the trust zone between trust zones like they did when we had one large trust zone as shown under the TIC 2 program. The diagram on the far right shows a Zero Trust environment. What you'll notice is that the network itself is not represented. As I mentioned earlier, the network is a suspect in a Zero Trust architecture. So we can restrain by having a strong reliance on identity management and access controls under a Zero Trust approach to TIC. Next slide, please. And then this is showing you, so we have, like I said, we have several efforts underway since the release of the TIC Cloud Use Case. We're mapping out the TIC capabilities to Zero Trust. The graphs are intended to show you how, so the one on the right is an overall mapping of Zero Trust, TIC security capabilities to the Zero Trust pillars. The top left breaks that down into what we called strong alignment and weak alignment. So the intent behind that second, the top left graphic is to show that while we do have strong alignment in areas that really weren't a shocker to us, right? Network, visibility, and applications, particularly with applications, the email as a service use case, the TIC isn't going to necessarily answer your zero trust concerns, and so then you see where TIC has gaps. That's the weaker alignment, and you can use, this is where you'll need to augment your capability, your TIC security capabilities that you have with other capabilities such as identity management, CDM, protective DNS, and others. Next slide, please. All right, so next slide, please. So I'm gonna briefly talk about TIC overlays here. So again, the overlay's intent is to align TIC security capabilities with available vendor products, services, and applications. But I do want to mention that the overlays may not represent a comprehensive list of vendor services, and agencies are not constrained to the solutions detailed in the existing overlays. These overlays are created and managed by the vendors. Overlays will often be developed independently of a TIC use case. However, some vendors may align their overlay to specific use cases in unique situations. Basically what I'm saying there is the vendor may only have capabilities that align with a specific use case and not all of the capabilities listed in the capabilities catalog. The intention behind the overlays is to help agencies select a solution to fulfill all or some of the security capabilities that they need with that service. You may need to use multiple overlays when an agency when you decide to combine the services of more than one vendor to implement a single use case. You have the flexibility to select vendor solutions and augment those solutions to make them compatible with your risk tolerance. Overlays can be used to support activities such as planning, acquisition, implementation, design, and technical analysis, and can be used with other artifacts to implement your TIC solutions, such as project plans, requirements documents, security guidance, and control tables. In a nutshell, as you are deploying your TIC 3.0 architectures, it's always a good idea to ask the vendor if they've completed an overlay. We have worked with, we know that there are several vendors out there who have done overlays, but CISA does not, again, keep track of these. We ask the vendors to map their services and technologies for the capabilities and maintain that list. It would be too difficult with the constant changing of vendor services and adding new capabilities. It would be almost next to impossible for CISA to maintain those. So we ask vendors to do that, and we just if you're interested in those, when you're talking to your vendors, just ask if they have a vendor overlay. Next slide, please. The overlay handbook is an overview of how the overlays can be used, and your interpretation. I mean, I'm not going to read these to you, but they're intended to help you, but again, you have to consider your risk management framework and your risk tolerances to determine, if the current vendor you're looking at is good enough, or if you need to augment the current vendor with something else. Next slide, please. So just some conclusions. Next slide, please. Summarize what we've talked about here. So again, the release of the cloud use case for TIC 3 is the final use case that was mandated for CISA to create under OMB policy 19.26. that doesn't mean that TIC is going away. It just means that we will be using the concepts and ideas as we build out services and as we talk to agencies and help them when they come to us for guidance. So the TIC, the concepts and guidance that were in those documents are used. More recently, some of you may be aware of the recently released BOD, and in that BOD you will see not only information but diagrams in that BOD for the network management interfaces that look similar to TIC. And so that's how TIC will be used in the future, is for directives, guidance, and other future activities. 34 new capabilities were added to the capabilities catalog, which required us not to only release the cloud use case and the security capabilities catalog, but to update the branch office and remote user use case to incorporate those security capabilities and provide specific guidance around how to use those capabilities in those use cases. Our core documents can be used by agencies to develop new use cases in support of your transition to zero trust architectures. Next slide, please. All right, let's talk about CISA's protective DNS service. So CISA replaced E3A DNS sinkhole with the protective DNS service as part of CISA's broader effort to secure federal networks and enhance the government's cybersecurity position at large. The DNS service resolves human-readable host names to internet protocol addresses, and the service was created due to vulnerabilities and insufficient protections that existed. DNS is a common threat vector for attack campaigns, which is the other reason why it was created. And so CISA's protective DNS service prevents government internet traffic from reaching malicious destinations by using state-of-the-art DNS technologies and a combination of CISA's proprietary and commercial threat intelligence to prevent malicious DNS content from compromising government networks, devices, and information. Unlike many other CISA capabilities and services, protective DNS is mandated by law. We talked about that earlier. And agencies are required to use it and route all their egress DNS traffic to this service, which sits outside of agency networks and does not interfere with their internal DNS infrastructures. The service is using a recursive DNS offering, which is provided by Cloudflare. Cloudflare is one of the leading DNS providers in the world. While the resolver is using the same engine that is offered to Cloudflare commercial customers, 2 additional features were built exclusively for CISA. These features were the web management interface that gives both CISA and agencies access to their data and dashboards, and the data lake, which stores all query and responses for up to 3 years. It is important to note that this is not an authoritative DNS service for .gov domains. However, CISA is in the process of building these services and expects it to go live early next year. The intent of the service is to protect organizational networks, not only organizational networks, but also devices that were previously challenging to protect, such as cloud, mobile, and nomadic devices. Next slide, please. This slide shows the overall architecture of CISA's protective DNS service. And so you can see how everything works together to provide the protections that you previously were afforded from E3A. Next slide, please. Talk about E1, E2 modernization efforts real quick. This program is going to go, this name is going to change. We haven't come up with the new name yet. But the objective, so it's in its infant, it's very immature at this point. We're in an information gathering era. On June 21st of this year, an RFI was released through GSA Region 8. And we wanted to understand what capabilities were available to CISA in order to gain better visibility into agency networks that were previously that is currently being done through the Einstein 1 and Einstein 2 capabilities. You'll see here that our objectives in that RFI, I won't read them to you, you can see them, but these were all questions that were asked of the vendor, of the vendors. That RFI process recently shut down on July 21st. And so the team right now is going through and analyzing the responses that we received. And those responses will help drive future activities for replacing the Einstein E1, E2 program. Next slide, please. All right, with that, that is the end of my presentation. I will now turn it over to Joseph Drummond from the National Cybersecurity and Protective Service to talk to you about NCPS. Thank you very much.
Hey, good morning, everyone. So before I talk about CLAW, I just wanted to provide some context into what Kevin just explained, right? So we have the legacy E1, E2 sensor grid that agencies are leveraging that are part of their TIC and MTIPS architecture. Then you have the agencies that are migrating to TIC 3.0 that no longer have the ability, due to their architectural options and evolution, no longer presenting traffic to those Einstein devices in TIC and MTIPS. And so CLAW is a capability that allows agencies to still provide cybersecurity telemetry data to CISA to meet that legislative requirement, but does it outside of the traditional means, right? And so in the last bit that Kevin referenced, there's a new effort that's focused on looking at physical sensor placement to fill in additional gaps. And so I just wanted to highlight that transition from legacy NCPS capability moving forward to CLAW being able to collect visibility from in a cloud environment and also from multiple environments. CLAW is a cloud-based system that can collect a multitude of logging types, and we'll talk about that later on in the presentation. And then to this new effort that Kevin just talked about, which is looking at new physical sensors and the potentiality of deploying them across, well, not across necessarily, but in certain places in the federal civilian executive branch. And so CLAW, like I said earlier, is a cloud-based technology, and it's also distributed. Like the diagram shows, CLAW resides in AWS. That's where the central CLAW resides. But we have what's called a CLAW talent, or a CLAW transfer at location optimized node. What this sensor does, it's placed in the region of the cloud service provider that an agency operates in. And so if we're collecting data from the Azure environment, we can place a CLAW talent within that region so that when an agency transfers the data to that talent, it's at no cost, because we're taking advantage of the no cost transfer for intra-region data transfer, right? Now, when we ingest the data from our Azure talent into our central AWS CLAW, CISA will incur the cost. But one of the CLAW was developed during a lot of, during the time the OMB 2131 logging memo came out, and we were looking at moving away from having a monolithic architecture that's focused on the data ingestion, the data analysis, the signature development, et cetera, like Einstein was. We thought about if we took a more modular approach, separated the ingestion from the analytics, and developed a flexible architecture that resides in the cloud, we'd be able to have more longevity in this particular technology effort. Next slide, please. right? And so I spoke to this earlier. Traditionally, Einstein devices were placed at TIC locations, but agencies utilizing cloud resources, also leveraging software-defined network technologies, they were going to the internet and not providing or not going through trusted internet connections, and we were losing out on visibility. You know, significant portion of network traffic from the FSEP is also encrypted, and so we wanted to take a different approach in getting the visibility that we would need to support our cyber operational mission. Next slide, please. And so this slide, you know, kind of provides a very high overview of what CLAW is. And so like I spoke about earlier, we didn't want to just create a architecture to collect one thing. We wanted to create a architecture that we could deploy as infrastructure as code that could collect a very large variation in log types, understanding that, you know, our understanding of the cyber operational environment is what is guiding CISA to select what data to collect, right? The more the cyber operational value of the data, the more that we can leverage it to support our operational mission. And this is also trying to get out of that mindset of that we have to collect everything, right? No, we need to assess the cyber operational environment and collect data that can actually be used to mitigate threats. And so CLAW was built on that notion that, you know, we might be collecting VPC flow logs today, but tomorrow we might need to collect Azure AD logs. How do we make that pivot, that adjustment really quick to be able to collect that specific data? And so that was kind of the impetus behind the architecture. Next slide, please. And so one of the, I think one of the amazing things that I got to highlight with this is how much the vendor community was willing to work with us. We came out with the Insera Volume 1 and 2, or the NCPS Interface Reference Architecture documents. The first one talking about in detail about the capability of the cloud log aggregation warehouse, or CLAW, and the second one really talking about those data, what we call data integration patterns, right? And so if we're collecting log data from an Azure environment, we try to leverage the native services like event hubs to be able to send telemetry to CLAW, right? We wanted to make sure that we were leveraging technologies that agencies are already familiar with. We were operating environments that agencies are currently operating in, and the vendors have made it very easy to integrate with third-party cybersecurity services like SASEs. Like, for instance, we support the direct ingest of data from Zscaler, Palo Alto, a couple of other vendors that agencies are leveraging more and more in their TIC 3.0 leaning architectures. And so I think the vendors stepping up and actually being able to create configuration guides that show how to integrate with CLAW, Google, Microsoft, number of blog posts on how agencies can integrate with CLAW. So next slide, please. Right, and this goes kind of the order of operations, if you will, in this workflow, where we being CISA would send over intelligence requirements, or specifically log elements. We would leverage something like EVRF, or the Extensible Visibility Reference Framework, to inform what telemetry we need to collect from a threat perspective. We would pass those requirements over to agencies that they would work with the vendor to, or not, because most agencies do this within their own shop, to configure their environments to be able to send the telemetry to CLAW. Like I said, in Azure, it's event hubs. In Google, it's PubSub. And so we're working to provide a Talon-like sensor for each of the top 3 major cloud service providers, so that we'd be able to support the ingestion of telemetry from Google, AWS, and Microsoft environments. And so when we're collecting the data, we have a form where we collect some contextual information about the data that's being sent over to CISA, right? So we want to know the telemetry type, the format. We can support a total of about 5 formats right now, but we're really flexible. We're able to write parsers to handle a multitude of variety of data types on our end. and theoretically, every data type that's listed in OMB 2131, we could support the collection of if needed. And so just to hint at the flexibility of the architecture. And so in turn, what we provide back to the agency, of course, is awareness of any malicious activity that we find, but also to peel back the onion a bit. I would say that there are smarter minds than me working from a data science perspective, from a data engineering perspective, to build signatures that we'd be able to pass back to agencies so that, they can hunt in their own environments for malicious activities. I think at scale, that would be the final form of this concept, if you will. We are collecting the data, but building tools, capabilities, products, and signatures off the data and passing those back to the FSEB. Next slide, please. And so this goes into a little bit more detail of what I just explained before. The sensor positioning is real important when we talk about the details of data and value. We don't want the traffic from VPC to VPC. We're looking for ingress egress traffic to the internet. Also the determination of that telemetry type. Are you sending Zscaler NSS logs, VPC flow logs, NetFlow 9, IPFix? And so we do this when agencies first reach out. We have an orientation meeting if they haven't met with the CLAW team before, and then we pass on the interconnection security agreement that needs to be signed by their CIO and our CIO before we can proceed with establishing the connection. And then they also have the onboarding form that characterizes the data, and they also provide a high-level architecture diagram. The next meeting is with the technical team, where we go over and confirm the technical solution that we're going to use for implement. Like I said, based on the architecture, it could be Event Hub, Pub Subs for Google, or a couple of Logstash options in AWS, depending if you're sending us data from commercial or gov. And so once the technical implementation is confirmed, then we schedule an onboarding date. And so there's been a lot of interest over the summer. And so we have about 8 to 10 agencies in the queue. And so please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Next slide. Right, and so kind of to highlight where we're going, right? Like Einstein was designed to collect telemetry from on-prem resources. We're looking at NetFlow data, one type. It had intrusion detection capability. And so this CLAW kind of highlights us evolving our architecture along with the technology landscape and the threat as well. And so CLAW being able to support the ingest of multiple log types and being able to pivot based on the threat. And so now in this area, or this era of zero trust, if you will, being able to collect telemetry from certain policy enforcement points, and being able to not only that, but characterize those domains, whether it be network or host, have an understanding of what visibility is being generated in those domains, and then prioritizing what logs should be collecting out of those domains. I think we're going to see CISA having a lot more nuance in this space when in the path forward when it comes to data collection. Next slide, please.
My name is John Sims. I work in the cybersecurity division at CISA and have been co-leading the zero trust efforts at CISA for the last couple of years. Also supported Kevin and Sean Connolly on the TIC program. So what I want to try to do here is, I know you guys have received a lot of information from Kevin and JD on TIC and the CLAW and CPS, but I want to try and weave that into this part of the presentation so that we can kind of sew it up a little bit. So on this slide, really the biggest thing to take away from this is that a lot of what we've done over the past several years, not only with TIC 3.0, but with the cloud security technical reference architecture and zero trust, is really look at how we can modernize our approaches to cybersecurity. And so looking at NIST SP 800-207 is one of the primary drivers of zero trust, in conjunction with the release of Executive Order 14028 and also M-2209 shortly thereafter. It really gave us an opportunity to lean in on zero trust and advanced architectures to support a lot of like what we're dealing with, especially after SolarWinds. Next slide, please. And so the zero trust maturity model, as Kevin indicated, was updated from version 1 back in April of 2023, which is a couple months ago. And one of the key elements of that was just making sure it was aligned to M-2209, which came out after version 1 was released. Next slide, please. So just to orient everyone to to the model itself, we laid it out into the vertical pillars you see here for identity, devices, networks, applications and workload, and data. And you'll see at the bottom of this graphic that we have visibility, analytics, automation, orchestration, as well as governance. And so one of the things that I think that's key here is that if when you were listening to what Kevin was saying about the capabilities of TIC 3.0 and what JD was talking about with the CLAW and with NCPS, it really covers a fair amount of these capabilities. I think it's important also to mention CDM as another capability that has been supporting our devices pillar with EDR and some of the censoring that we've been deploying for the past 5 to 10 years. One other thing I'll just say is that when we were putting version 1 together back in the summer of 2021, we really were influenced by what NIST put out in SP 800-207, what DoD had just released back in February of 21 with their DoD Zero Trust Reference Architecture, as well as GSA and NSA Zero Trust publications. Next slide, please. And so, just taking stock, this is a similar slide to what Kevin presented for the TIC. We released the version 1 in October of 2021 publicly, so we could get a request for comment out, and we received nearly 400 comments back from not only industry but also trade associations and agencies and some academic institutions. Next slide, please. And so, some of the other key elements besides the RFC that really influenced what we put in version 2 was driven by a lot of the work that we did in partnership with OMB, working with departments and agencies to work or to review their zero trust implementation plans, as well as a lot of the CyberStat workshops. Sean Connolly and myself supported the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee subcommittee on zero trust and trusted identity management. That committee was primarily, composed of private sector and a few government agencies. One person in particular that I want to give a shout out to is John Kindervag. He is known affectionately as the father of zero trust. He was a primary thought leader in that committee work as well. That resulted in a policy paper that was delivered to the president in February of 22. Also, another thing I'll just mention is we did a lot of modernization deep dives with agencies, as well as one-on-one discussions with the agencies about particular challenges that they were having with their plans and strategies in relation to M-2209. Next slide, please. And so, what's really new? I will tell you that we refreshed a fair amount of the content, added a lot of depth to it. But the one thing I'll point out in particular is, Kevin showed you that graphic of the mountain, and really looking at, where you are at the bottom, which is the traditional level of maturity, which really looks at the perimeter focused architectures we've been using for the past 25 years. The initial is really about acknowledging that there's a huge gap between the traditional maturity level, which is focused on perimeter, and the advanced, which is really looking at more automation that's being integrated into the environment to support zero trust. And so that's really where the initial steps in and kind of shows that movement across that journey. Next slide, please. And so, one of the things that I think that's important to look at here is that I think a lot of the work that we've done with TIC 3.0 since September of 2019, looking at what agencies were experiencing as we were going into a fully remote telework posture, back in March of 2020, that really gave us a chance to look at how we could shift a lot of the data center focused features that we use for remote access into agency environments into cloud. And so, key to that is that I think that we were able to lay a lot of good foundations for what we see in M-2209 and where we're going with zero trust. Next slide, please. And so some of the key updates, for the identity pillar, I'll go through these very quickly, is, consolidation of identity stores, access management and provisioning for onboarding and offboarding, key areas of zero trust and identity. Next slide, please. For the device, just looking at adding additional content for, supply chain risk management, device threat protection, endpoint detection and response, as well as policy enforcement and compliance monitoring. Next slide, please. And for the networks, we added additional information on microsegmentation, traffic encryption, as well as network resilience as key features of the version 2 in the network pillar. Next slide, please. For the applications and workload, this was one area that, we added a lot of information about application security testing, which is a key feature to, especially custom developed applications. So there's content in there about going from automated to manual expert analysis, as well as some of the automated scanning capabilities that agencies are using now. The other thing is application threat protections was another area that we added more content to. Next slide, please. For data, the data categorization and data inventory management, as well as availability, are some key areas that we updated here, as well as the encryption capabilities that were called for in M-2209. Next slide, please. So the cross-cutting capabilities, just referencing back to some of the things that Kevin and JD were saying with regard to CLAW, visibility and analytics. I think that this is where agencies can increase their visibility through M-2131 and their own logging needs. Beyond that, to help not only inform their visibility in their own environments, not only on-prem but cloud, but also as an ingest point for policy decision making and conditional access, for example. So that's a key area that, I think needs a little bit more attention. We touched on that and integrated that across each of the pillars to make sure there's a clear, clear linkage between the three horizontal capabilities in each of the pillars. Next slide, please. So this one just talks about some of the new functions, several of which I just spoke to, access management and identity, device threat protection and devices, network resilience and traffic management for the network pillar, secure application development, workflow, and I'm going to call out application security testing again. And then in the data pillar, the data categorization and data availability. Next slide, please. And so, as we let the dust settle on the release of version 2, some of the things we're looking at doing in the next year or two, we're not thinking that we're going to be doing any major revisions to the Zero Trust maturity model, but rather looking at ways to enhance the content that's there, providing greater clarity to the capabilities, just looking at some of the application pillar topics that need additional time and attention. CISA has released our secure by design and secure by default guidance recently, which I think is very much tied to what we're trying to achieve with Zero Trust. So I think that you'll see more specific guidance coming out towards application security, but also one area that we just kicked off is operational technology and how you apply Zero Trust in those environments. Beyond that, as we look at building out additional content, I believe we're also going to be looking at developing some use cases that's somewhat pre-decisional at this point, but those are some areas that we're looking at in terms of enhancing what we have already in version 2. Next slide, please. So now we can get into the questions. So I'll turn it back over to Brian and the GSA team. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, John. And thank you to Kevin Wortman and thank you to JD from the CISA team for presenting us a lot of this great information today. I just want to remind everybody, since that was a lot of information, CISA has a great website with TIC information. And you can definitely check out the TIC website that has a lot of that information that was covered today. We are tracking, I just want to remind everyone, we are tracking the questions that are coming in the chat and some of them have been answered, but if for whatever reason we do not get to your question, we'll definitely get back to you via email. So now I'm just going to take a brief moment to present to you how the Enterprise Infrastructure Solutions, EIS contract, can help provide you services that help agencies move forward with modernizing their infrastructure and allowing industry to create solutions for the TIC 3.0 requirements. Excuse me. As a part of that process, we here at GSA also provide assistance and guidance on these requirements and how they can be incorporated into solicitation. So how does EIS support agencies? EIS supports agencies by providing services that enable agency IT modernization and solutions for TIC 3.0 and Zero Trust. The value EIS can provide to your agency is to make it easier for agencies to modernize their IT infrastructure with less risk while gaining the benefits of improved performance, enhanced cybersecurity, and potentially lower costs. For example, EIS services can help agencies access the benefits for cloud computing and shared services while increasing security and potentially lowering those costs. EIS offers the Trusted Internet Connection Service, we call that TICS, that provides the security posture needed to support a cloud-based infrastructure. EIS also offers the software-defined wide area networking solutions, which is a key pillar for enterprise network modernization and the enabler of several of the TIC 3.0 use cases. The way EIS is structured enables the service provider with the ability to propose and construct several components of a Zero Trust architecture under a single award. EIS also offers multiple different managed services that could assist with further integration to help agencies move closer to a Zero Trust solution. Next slide, please. Supporting EIS service examples, we realized that you're not just going to go from a legacy network implementation directly to a new TIC 3.0 solution environment. There are a couple of activities that should be done to help move from a legacy network to a more modern network that incorporates TIC 3.0 solutions. For example, using EIS broadband internet service, BIS, will complete the network transport underlay for agencies deploying the SD-WAN overlay using the software-defined wide area network service. If you're currently using TDM-based transport, Ethernet Transport Service, ETS, will help you move to that Ethernet-based transport. OMB Memo 2107 released back in 2020 stating that all executive branch departments and agencies are to transition all of their IP-enabled assets away from IPv4 addressing to native IPv6 only addressing. EIS Internet Protocol Service, IPS, can help you with that transition from IPv4 to IPv6. We also have the Internet Protocol Voice Service, IPVS, which can be used to help agencies move from legacy voice to IP voice. Additional examples we have is the EIS Managed Security Service Suite, which includes a range of services that provide the building blocks to enable the creation of customized solutions for agency TIC 3.0 requirements. TIC helps you move from MTIPs to solutions encompassing TIC 3.0. Mentioned earlier on the previous slide, we talked about the software-defined wide area network. And so we also have SD-WANs, which is what we call the software-defined wide area network service, which provides connectivity options to from agency networks, cloud services, and the internet. It also provides the management overlay. VPNS, Virtual Private Network Service, that contains the cloud service provider connection feature, where vendors can provide cloud connection to agencies specified public and or private cloud service providers. Next slide, please. So just to highlight some additional information about the Trusted Internet Connection Service, TICS. TICS was created to replace the MTIP service on EIS. The approach would be to use TICS to supplement MTIPs or replace it completely depending on how far an agency is with moving to a totally cloud-based environment, or have a hybrid environment that has both on-premise and in the cloud. As different agencies may require different solutions, agencies can customize TICS to ensure that they're creating the appropriate requirements that industry can bid against. We mentioned earlier that it's a sub-service under the Managed Security Service Suite, which complements the other sub-services such as Managed Prevention Service, Vulnerability Scanning Service, and Incident Response Service. TICS also helps to securely modernize access to agency data, the internet and cloud services, as well as decreases latency and improves the user experience. Most importantly, TICS allows for the service providers to create TIC 3.0 solutions or to enhance other EIS services to meet the TIC 3.0 security objectives and capabilities outlined in the updated CISA guidance. When you combine TICS with these other EIS services and managed security service sub-services while following the most updated CISA TIC guidance, your result will be a safe, flexible, and repeatable TIC solution that will address those security objectives and capabilities for TIC 3.0. Next slide, please. So here we can offer solicitation support to agencies with EIS. So the first assistance that we can provide is the Solicitation Assistance Tool session. And this is basically a virtual meeting with GSA EIS subject matter experts to drive the Solicitation Assistance Tool and to provide agencies consultation. Agency attendees during these sessions are usually the project manager, contracting officer, core, subject matter experts, and technical personnel. The tool is a wizard-based tool that is used to identify major solicitation details. For example, information such as contract type, services an agency is looking to acquire, periods of performance, and etc. At the end of the session, an initial draft solicitation, which would be an unprotected Word document, would be generated with the agency's provided requirements at that time. And we would provide that to the agencies so that they could take that initial draft solicitation and customize that draft solicitation with a specific contract and technical requirements to be ready for bid. The second option we provide assistance with is we provide a scope review. And so the EIS scope review process allows agencies to submit their final draft solicitation to be reviewed by GSA. The scope review consists of 3 parts: the contractual review, technical review, and pricing review. During the contractual review, GSA contracting officers will take a look at that agency's draft solicitation. The GSA EIS technical team will take a look at the technical parts, and a GSA pricing team will review the pricing data in that solicitation. Once the scope review process is completed, GSA will provide feedback to the agency if necessary. Next slide, please. So here are just some quick resources supporting TIC 3.0 solutions that EIS can provide. We have the EIS Pricer website, which contains the service guide and lists all of the available EIS services that you can order and provides in detail the technical information you would need to know about an EIS service. The GSA Solutions Development Branch develops white papers and quick-to-read use case documents on a multitude of ways agencies can use EIS to modernize their IT infrastructure and to be TIC 3.0 compliant. We're always continuing to release and update all of our resources, so please be sure to check out the EIS Pricer, which contains the service guide and all of these resources, such as the white papers and use cases. Next slide, please. And for more information and assistance related to EIS, please don't hesitate to contact us. You can either go to our website, which is www.gsa.gov/EIS, or you can email the Solutions Development Technical Assistance Group at sdtech@gsa.gov. One last thing before we go to the Q&A session is we will be, if you would like to request a copy of the slides, we will send out a post email giving you the contact information on who to contact if you'd like to request a copy of the slides. That's it for my presentation. Let's start the question and answer session. I know we had some couple of questions already in the chat, and some of them have been answered, but can I ask Kevin Guffey, did we have any questions that we might have not addressed so far yet?
So the one question that we have is from Conrad, and it's with regard to PQC. And let me scroll through all of this. How is the TIC 3.0 impacted by the mandate to move to post-quantum cryptography? And from GSA's perspective, we actually have a PQC working team. We're working on a lot of guidance, but more importantly, we're working on ensuring that our contracts have methods to ensure that within the executive order, we can assist agencies with getting their high-value systems looked at, scanned, so on and so forth. And then, of course, PQC in and of itself actually complements TIC 3.0. It does not replace it. Mostly, the goal for us is to make sure that we have resources that agencies can wrap their hands around, have at their disposal to aid them as we move into the future. But it's important right now that TIC 3.0 be implemented and that we continue to harden our information, because the store now, decrypt later problem will be an issue in the future if we don't do so. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Kevin. Just checking here, just making sure we didn't miss anything else.
And we can also send out responses to the questions in addition to the one we just answered.
Definitely. So I'm not seeing any additional questions at this moment. So I'll end with saying we will definitely send out an email to all the participants today. Thank you for coming. And we'll provide in that email some of these questions that we covered, any responses to those questions. We'll also give you the contact information for GSA and CISA if you would like to request a copy of the slides, and if you would like to start new conversations with us on TIC 3.0 or how to come up with how we can help you build your solutions for TIC 3.0. Other than that, I think that's it for me. I will turn it back to Kiva for the closing of the event.
Thank you, Brian. I have nothing to add. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Please notice the closing message in the chat and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.